Well, welcome to ACON 2. We got the experts in the house. We have Matt Nelson, the primary grader over at CGC, Deniz Kahn, the president, Wata Games. So thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much to both of you for being elite sponsors of our event. It's much appreciated. And we're here to have a really interesting and fun conversation about grading comics versus grading video games, and we got the right people in here. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and get started with a little introduction about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. My name's Matt Nelson. I'm primary grader at CGC. I've been here for a little over 7 years. Prior to that, I was very heavily involved in comics, dealing, pressing, restoration, pretty much doing a little bit of everything. And then 7 years ago, I joined the CGC team, and since then, yeah, we've been rocking and rolling. So things going really well.
Awesome. Excellent. Deniz?
I'm Deniz Kahn. I'm one of the founders and president of Wata Games. We are the certification company for video games of all types. My background, I initially started going to comic shows with my dad, who's a comic collector, when I was a little kid. So that was my first exposure to collectibles was comics, but the generation and the collectible that appealed to me was video games. So I started collecting actively in around 2007, and saw the need for reliable professional third-party certification like what exists with CGC for comics for video games. So Wata Games started a few years ago and a couple years ago, and we've been rocking and rolling since.
Awesome. So let's just go ahead and what we want to get out of this is we want to talk about the different processes and kind of unpack some of the similarities and the differences and just educate. So Matt, why don't you kind of just give us an overview? A comic comes in, it arrives raw at CGC. Why don't you just kind of talk about that process and the things you're taking into account, and just give us an overview of that whole thing?
Sure. There's usually two primary ways that people submit books to us, either through the mail or at shows. Obviously, this year with the shows being shut down, it's mostly through the mail, and we have a special deal set up to make it easier for people to submit to us through that. We use the online form, and the books arrive here. We unpack them, inspect them, make sure everything's fine. Receiving department puts them into the system, and they await grading at that point. Then they move to grading. And we have obviously our team of experts that grade the books. So we grade obviously every day. We're grading moderns, vintage, anything from books that came out last week to the most expensive golden age comics. And then after we grade them, we do a restoration check. Our team, there's several steps involved in the grading process. We take notes, count all the pages, check for restoration, finally assign a grade and page quality. And once that's finished, the books move to encapsulation, where they're placed into our tamper-proof holder and sealed. And then they move to QC, who checks over the holders and the orders, makes sure everything is fine. And then they're packed up and shipped out to the customer. And then, of course, we have a lot of other things online on our website, like our census, where those books go once they're graded. We have registry sets for people that compete with who has the best set of a particular title. And then we also have pressing. CCS is our sister company. So, and the step before grading, if somebody wants to press their comic, it'll go through CCS first, and that's a process where we basically press the book flat, get all the dents out, dry cleaning dirt off, removing spine rolls, basically get the book looking as perfect as possible before it moves into grading. And then at that point, we grade it and encapsulate it and ship it out.
Awesome. Thank you. And then maybe Deniz, maybe you can describe the process on your guys' side also.
Yeah, there are not a lot of differences. The overall process is pretty much the exact same. There's obviously small differences based on what we do with video games. Like we don't have a restoration check, and then when the games come in, they're all sorted, and we actually take pre-grading photos of all the games, because sometimes when like a complete in-box game is encapsulated, you don't know what's inside. So the pre-grading photos will show you all the different inserts and the manual, the posters, the dust sleeve, and you can check those on your dashboard or by scanning the the matrix code on the back of each game. But overall, it's pretty much the same thing. Things come in, we process them. There's cleaning, general cleaning that we do, heavy cleaning. That's sort of like a little bit like a restoration. check our version of that. But then they're graded. We do, again, same thing, modern, everything from old, Atari 8-bit consoles to modern PS3 and PS4, Switch really soon coming out. And then things are sent to encapsulation, QC, and then shipped back out. So the overall process is very similar. But, depending on what the submission type is, there's going to be some variance there.
Awesome. So, the two of you are experts in your own field, so we're interested to know your answer on this. So, Matt, you've been in comics, you've been grading comics for a long time. So, what do you think is the biggest? What is the biggest challenge when it comes to grading comics?
There's several things. Obviously, assigning the grade can be tough. It depends on the books. We get all kinds of books and all kinds of grades. The higher the grade, the easier it is to grade, just because you're dealing with a fewer number of defects. It's easier to quantify. It's more of a science. As you get down the grading scale into the lower grades, you're dealing with a lot of different defects that you have to take together cumulatively to arrive at a grade. So it's more of an art. So I think achieving consistency with those kind of books is a very difficult aspect of the process. And the other thing I'd say would be restoration check. Some restoration is very obvious, but some of it's very subtle. And again, it's something that's very important to the grading process because it can really affect the value of a book if it comes out restored. So we have to make sure that we check every book and make sure that it's, we catch everything that we see, because that's going to ensure the accuracy of the grade and the value of the book afterwards.
Awesome.
And then Dennis, I assume the same question to you. There's a lot of factors involved with grading games. Not only fully sealed, but if they're not, you got to look at everything. There's a lot of factors at play there.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're talking, take a NES complete in box game, you're grading 3 different mediums, right? You have plastic for the cartridge, you have essentially a mini comic book with the manual, and then you have the box, which is cardboard. So it's the same idea, though, in terms of the challenge is just achieving consistency and being able to train new graders on how to, especially once you get into the lower grades, deal with the different kinds of flaws across these 3 mediums. Also, the other big challenge, just like with checking restoration with comic books, it's checking authenticity with video game reseals. And as the prices of video games are going up, we're seeing a lot more people that are trying to pass through resealed games. So games that have been opened, but then they're sealing them back up and passing them through as original, authentic factory seals. So staying ahead of the game and being, having the most sophisticated ways to check for those is critical. But I'd say those are probably the 2 biggest challenges, which is kind of, in the same way, the same thing you're doing with comics, but just a little bit different.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a nuts and bolts kind of follow up for both of you. So Matt, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned CCS, and of course they do pressing services, but one thing I've used them over and over for is restoration removal. And I just want to point out they do a great job. They do a great job at that. And can you kind of give us an overview really quick? We see the restoration, C1, A, whatever. Can you just give us a quick overview of what does that scale mean and what do those things mean?
Sure. Yeah, we expanded it about 4 years ago, but currently we have there's 2 things that we grade on restoration. We grade the quality of the work and the quantity of the work, and so the quality is the A, B, and C. There's 3 tiers for that. A obviously is professional, C would be amateur, and B would be somewhere in between. And then the quantity is 1 through 5, 1 obviously being slight and 5 being extensive. So it's an expansion of what we had the first 15 years, which was only 2 qualities and 3 quantities. So we expanded it now to 3 qualities and 5 quantities. So A1 would be like the slightest restoration that's done professionally. And that's going to be like color touch, tear seals, reinforcement, very minor things that are done to a book. And then obviously C5 would be like your heavily restored amateur, markers and pieces filled with typing paper or something. And then we also have a subcategory called conservation, which we also introduced about 4 years ago. So that's kind of a subset of the A1 category because A1 is obviously there are two situations where people end up with A1. Either it's something that's slight in nature that's not going to change, like color touch or cover cleaning or something. So sometimes people try to move that into the conserved category because conserved labels are actually, they have a little bit more of a premium above restored, because the point of conserved is to preserve the book for the future. So it doesn't really involve adding things to the book or aesthetically improving it like with color touch. So that's going to be like professionally done materials like tear seals, reinforcement, professional cover cleaning, piece reattachment, spine splits that are sealed, basically just getting the book back together so you can hold it. When you go beyond that, aesthetically improving the book through color touch, trying to improve, basically make it look as new as possible again, then you're into the restored category. But yeah, overall, there's like 10 or 12 different things you could, restoration types that you can be done to a book. I pointed out most of them, like color touch, piece fill, tear seals, reinforcement, cleaning. Then there's also amateur stuff like reglossing, where they use like a fixative, they spray the covers, something they did back in the day. Trimming is one, which is a no-no in the hobby, but that's cutting off the edges to make the book look perfect. So there's a lot of different things in there, but generally 10 or 12 things, and then they fall into that ABC or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 category.
That's a great summary of a really complicated and involved area. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it adds a whole nother level to grading, because you're not just grading the book now, you're also grading the work that was done to the book. Then you have to figure out how the work improved the book, or actually sometimes it can decrease the grade of the book if it's amateurs. So it adds a complexity to the grading that makes it a lot more difficult.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Okay, Dennis. So you got a video game and it's still sealed. So that is its own process. Can you just, if I have a sealed game and I send it into Wata, does the box and the seal get a separate grade, or how does that work?
Yep. And I've actually got an example of one of our, like a sealed game label here. So you can see here, this is a Dragon Warrior 4. You're going to have the box grade is going to be here, which is the overall grade. And then you're going to have a seal rating. The seal rating is a letter grade, and it goes anywhere from a C, C+, BB+, A+, and then you have an A++ for essentially what we call a case fresh seal, which is a seal that's basically been pulled out of the case packs they initially shipped to stores. Now, a lot of people that have their feet in both camps, comics and video games, have likened the seal rating to page quality. I think it's a pretty good analogy for the most part, especially for people in comics who are trying to understand, how these different notations are treated in video games. But as you get more into like modern games, just like, like modern books, there's modern video games, the seal rating matters a lot more, because you're going to have a lot of 9.6s and 9.8s where you're grading, like a PS2 game. These cases are pretty sturdy, so the premium on the actual wrap is a lot higher. But overall, we treat those two separately, because when you're looking at a game, you're really looking at two separate things. And historically, collectors have voiced that the box grade is what matters the most to them. But this way, we don't leave it up to get any guessing. You can decide as a collector when you're buying an item if you want to put more of a premium because something has a great seal, or if you care really more just about the box grade.
Awesome. And then when you have a game, so let's say an NES game, and it's been unwrapped, it's not sealed anymore. Now, like you said, you have to get into each of the components. So if people, I'm sure there's a lot involved in that, and maybe you want to show the subgrades kind of. Do you have a complete in box with you?
I do. So this is a Ring King for NES, and you can see we will list the variant of the box first, then the cartridge, and then the manual. And that's going, not to go down a rabbit hole, but variants are a whole crazy different thing. And then on the back, you'll see that there's subgrades. So you have the box, the manual, the cart, and then a weighted overall grade. This is an earlier case with an imp, so I won't get into that. This is like another game here. So you'll see the box on this one's a 9.2. The manual is what is it, a 9.8? The
Yeah.
cart's a 9.8, and overall it's a 9.6. So this is a really, really high grade complete in box game, which is probably why they got it graded. The weighting is 50% box, 30% the cartridge, and then 20% the manual. So in that way, we're kind of taking a little bit from like the card grading world, where they have a little bit of, they weight all the different factors that go into grading a card. So for complete in box, that's how that's calculated.
Awesome. So let's get into the history a little bit. So Matt, CGC, how long have you guys been grading games?
Or comics?
Yeah, comics.
0 years. We've been open since almost January 1st, 2000, almost exactly. So 20 years, working on our 21st year now. Like I said, I joined in early 13, but I've been working very closely with CGC almost since they opened. I think it's 2001. So I was there and watched how CGC came in, and I'm sure this is true for Wata too. It changed the landscape, and there had never been a certification company in comics before. So as is true for probably most of these collectible fields, there's always I guess a kind of a period of time in the beginning where it takes an adjustment for people to get used to it. You have people who resist it, people who embrace it, people who don't understand it. So there's a lot of education and trust building that has to go on in those first couple of years. But luckily CGC did a great job of that. And so, within a couple of years, it was clear, like Wata, that, the prices that were being realized because of the trust that was built by this certification led to an industry that expanded tremendously, brought a whole bunch of new collectors and investors in, and just made everything safe for everybody. And so, it opened up a lot of opportunities for people too. Not just grading, but signature series and pressing and restoration and online sales and everything. So it's been and it still seems like it's still growing after 20 years, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, well, the company speaks for itself, the reputation as well. Deniz, you guys are newer than that, right? But it's booming. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of Wata?
Yeah, Matt summed it up perfectly in terms of what reliable certification does, and we're seeing exactly that. We only launched, I think it was March of 2018, whenever C2E2 was. Matt, I don't know if you remember that launch, but we had like all these comics and video games and a big whole debut. And so it's really only been just shy over 2 years. But we've seen some of the, not just the service, but our partnership with like Heritage, for example, has put video games in front of a whole brand new audience. And with the confidence that they have with the certification, we're just seeing so many more people now jump into the hobby. It's growing month over month, just incredibly rapidly. I think one of the biggest challenges is that unlike when in 2000 when CGC came out, comics were more evolved as a collectible just overall. And so there were a lot more resources for collectors to be able to supplement, I guess, their purchasing decisions or their collecting decisions with. We don't have as much of that in video games. So a lot of people coming in don't have all of the resources that they might need, such as pricing information. Or information on what variants, what are the populations, what variants exist. So this is all it. For me, I think it's exciting because it gives a lot of time for that stuff to develop and a lot more opportunity for a lot of people getting into this to find sort of their niches or different whatever opportunity they want to find out of it. So I view it kind of as an exciting thing, but I think it's also one of the challenges that a lot of new collectors, we're constantly getting people saying, hey, where can I find out more about this? And it's like, well, we write an article,
Yeah.
We'll publish it. If you're an expert in something, share that with the community. We don't have the photojournal guide to video games, right? Like the Gerber books, which are fantastic. I used to use those as a resource for myself. We don't have an Overstreet guide, right? So we're trying to help in terms of making partnerships to bring this stuff out, but a lot of that still doesn't exist.
Okay, so for most of our audience, like you know, and we're not. I mean, they understand a lot about comics, generally speaking. I mean, they a lot of them, you know, they take a shot at grading their own comics. So for those people that have a comic and they're used to that, and now all of a sudden they want to get into video games. I mean, are there any resources like, you know, so that they can look at a box and kind of try to figure out what it might be? Like, what would you recommend, Dennis? And the manuals as well. Anything specifically you want to point to?
You know, we tried our best. We have a visual guide on our website. It's really hard with three-dimensional items, you know, because you have so many different sides to capture it in a photo. Funny enough, you know, a lot of people who are familiar with grading comics, I don't know if it's the ease of the scale or what, but they pick up our scale and just general flaws and how they're going to impact the grade very quickly. I've been very surprised at how quickly comic people coming into this hobby and getting their feet wet are able to understand the standards. They're pretty intuitive. There's a lot of online groups and social media groups where collectors are coming in and they're sharing their experiences and very quickly learning it. Obviously, trying out the service and, you know, guessing what you might get and seeing where it falls is a great test. Obviously, it's great because it gives submissions, but no, truly that's a way a lot of people have learned, you know, just by submitting how to hone in and essentially expect the grades within a grade or two of what they're going to get back. Other than that, it's you know, it's something that I think with time and just talking with other collectors, you'll get a lot more better grasp on how the scale works.
Okay. So Matt, so since you started versus today, I mean, you want to maybe identify one or two trends you've seen, some interesting trends from, you know, just over time, what you've noticed?
Yeah, sure. I'd say one of the biggest ones was, and this is probably going over the entire 20 years, when CGC started, and Dennis mentioned this earlier, you know, comics were in a much different place than video games are. And it's really interesting to hear him talk about where video games are at, because I'm thinking about comic books, and we did have resources. We had the Price Guide that was at that point had been coming out for 30 years. The photojournals were over a decade old. The internet had really not taken hold quite yet, so you didn't have a lot of of that. But you know, and you had a mature market, dealers, collectors that had big collections socked away, grading scale, you know, all that was there. But you know, but what I've noticed though since then is that as certification has allowed the industry to really grow, especially with the movies, and you have this huge influx of new people coming in that weren't there in the 80s and 90s, that probably weren't even born back then. They're coming in and they're kind of, it's going backwards. They're seeing encapsulated books and they're buying them and they're seeing prices online, and then they're educating themselves backwards, educating themselves about the history of comics, about the runs, the stories, the grading standards, restoration, pricing, all that stuff. And so I think there's a reliance now more on CGC grading, whereas when they first opened, it was kind of this weird situation where, you know, the dealers and the collectors were like, why are we paying you to tell us how to grade books? We know how to grade books. We've been doing this for, you know, decades, you know, and now 20 years later, we've got the opposite where, you know, people are depending on our grades because they don't know how to grade. Yeah. So that's a trend, which it's not alarming, but at the same time, I do think that's important for people to educate themselves on grading, if for nothing else, to understand, you know, how we arrive at what we do, and also to kind of help hone their collection, you know, what they want to collect in terms of grades. Because you know, and again, Dennis touched on this, where, you know, you look at a video game at a show and you're like, this is really cool, I played this when I was younger, but you know, how many copies exist, how many have been graded, you know, what's you know, how many other games are there from the same company, same year, same whatever, variants, all that. And so, you know, learning that stuff helps you get a broad perspective on the I guess comics or video games as a whole, which allows you to kind of narrow it down to what you want to collect, and it gives you you know, that with that perspective gives you more focus, and I think it makes for a better experience collecting and helps you build a better collection. So that's one trend. And I guess other than that, I mean, it's just the prices. I think one other thing I'd say is that what's shocking for me to think is how books that I'm 46, so, you know, I'm reading books in the late 80s, and, you know, New Mutants 98, Spidey 300, Spawn 1. And these books are brand new. And, the first Marvels were only 25, 26, 28 years old. And now, the books that I grew up reading are 30 years old. They're older than FF1. And FF1 now is like, almost 60 years old. And so the passage of time is freaking me out a little bit because I'm realizing how old I am compared to how old these comics are. So that it's interesting to see, kids or young people come to the shows and, they'll see a New Mutants 98 or a Hulk 181 in a case sitting next to a $50,000, event, 1940, a Batman 1. And they're just, the Hulk is what they see. That's what they recognize, Wolverine. Yeah. They know Batman, but, the focus of what's become hot and popular has shifted. It's moved, and this is also going in other collectibles like coins, where the younger generation is putting more focus on things that are newer, I guess, compared to what I was focused on. We were back, 30 years ago. So it just seems to keep shifting up. We call modern 1975 to present, but at some point we may have to recategorize that because when a book's 50, 60 years old, they can't call that a modern anymore. Right. So these are just that passage of time is another interesting trend.
Yeah,
it's kind of like when you see kids and they say, "Oh, I played Mario Brothers," and they're talking about Super Nintendo, or they're talking about N64 instead of the original NES Mario. You're like, "Come on, guys, you didn't play them more."
Right. We laugh, but it's like that X-Men 1 back there, the Magneto cover. It's my childhood. I know there's like 10 million of them, but I love the cover. And, to me, I look at that book and I'm like, yeah, that's modern. It just came out, but apparently it didn't just come out anymore. I mean, I'm 38. I'm not exactly a young kid anymore. And then, we got Kevin Eastman coming to AtCon. And I mean, obviously the Turtles were huge. So that explains, I've seen in the market a spike on all things Turtles. So I think there is a shift going on there.
Definitely.
Dennis, what about you? So any trends you've noticed since you started versus today in grading games?
Well, I think it's important to just focus on the last 6 months because that's when things are changing so fast. And one of the trends it's very similar as Matt has been talking about in that it's the focus of what people are actually buying and collecting. The same factors of what goes into demand. Previously it was just the rarity, just the sheer rarity of something for strict video game collectors, and what was relevant to video game collectors specifically. But now we have a third element, which is how relevant it is to pop culture, right? And so now you're seeing games that collectors historically were like, it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on the NES, or it's Pokemon, right? Or it's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. They're okay, whatever. But now that those games have just shot up so much because as people are coming into this hobby from other hobbies, not only is there a crossover appeal, but those are the most recognizable, iconic characters. At the end of the day, I view comics and video games as the two largest pop culture collectibles of our generation, right? Yeah. Even if you look at comics from the 80s and 90s, the ads inside of them are for video games. So
true.
Yeah.
And so many video games.
So it's the focus on the title characters and things that are recognizable. Just a sealed Super Mario Bros. In any variant, any shape has gone up 10x, in the last 2 years of what it used to be. Same with Zelda, same with the Pokemon games. It's just I think that's the biggest shift. That's both surprising to a lot of old-time video game collectors, but also it makes a lot of sense given where we're seeing the market going. So I would say that's probably the biggest trend right now. But the thing that happens and that we've seen is as people get more educated, that's what they start with, and then they start to go into the more esoteric or the obscure stuff, or they want to know, they want to have a game that has Saddam Hussein on the cover, similar to how in comics there's a big focus on horror or Nazi covers or something like that, right? People are looking for more unique things after they get their set of the popular stuff, right? So I think that's where we're seeing, but it's changing every day. We're just in this phase right now where there is no trend per se that you can hammer down. Things are just totally changing every day.
Yeah, it seems like with your and your business, your line, it is interesting because like you said earlier, there's like several things happening at once. You're not just building a census based on what you grade, you're building a huge database of information, the pictures, all the stuff that's opening up to all these potential collectors out there. And comics, like you said, a lot of that was there in place. It's like almost like grading was the last component. For you, it's like almost like one of the first components, and from that's coming all this other information. So it's I imagine that world is exploding at a rate I can't even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and it's Matt, that's totally it. And at first it was just, I mean, we had roots in comics, so this was very heavily marketed to the comic side. But now we're seeing coin people, we're seeing a lot of card people like Magic the Gathering. And people forget that Pokemon card collectors, which is now a big thing. Pokemon started as a video game, right? The video game came first, and then a whole separate collectible was spawned off of that, right? So now the Pokemon card collectors are like, why don't I have a sealed Pokemon Red or Blue? And so the price of those is just going crazy, right? But yeah, Matt, it's a very unique dynamic in that there's just so much coming out all at once, and it'll be exciting to see what happens in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years.
Yeah.
Is there any particular, book or game that particularly brings up nostalgia for you guys? Like Ollie's got his Magneto back there. What's the book or what's the game that really kind of relates to you guys the most?
Well, I guess I'll go first. There's not one particular. I mean, I grew up reading them, and then I quickly moved into collecting them. And I think this is true for a lot of collectors. You start with what's in front of you, what you're reading, and you build your runs. Like for instance, G.I. Joe was my first real comic that I started reading like every issue, and I couldn't wait to get the newsstand every month and get the next issue. I think number 49 was my first issue, and then quickly so I started putting a run of that together, and then my local comic store carried a lot of vintage, Silver Age, Bronze Age. So, I got an Overstreet, and all of a sudden, like the world opened up. So I started quickly collecting silver and bronze. And then, of course, the Golden Age was like, everybody kind of moves backwards in time, depending on, I guess, how far you want to go. Right. And so I moved back into that area. So, and now it's like I've seen so much at this point that, I'd say what I'm looking for is like really obscure, eclectic things that I don't really see often. Yeah. But that's not typical. Most people, like we've been talking about, gravitate towards things that they recognize. So like the most popular characters: Wolverine, Batman, Deadpool, Superman, all that stuff. For me, it's I love the covers. I'd say like Golden Age covers is probably what turns me on the most.
Excellent. How about you, Dennis?
Yeah, I mean, for me too, I didn't, when I started collecting, I was going after stuff I didn't have as a kid, actually. So, I didn't grow up with the NES. My first console was the Super Nintendo. Yeah. But the first set, I'm a set collector, and the first complete box set that I finished was NES. Then I finished N64. I recently finished Game Boy, and Super Nintendo, which is what I started collecting, is the only set that I haven't finished. Yeah. So it's very easy to get distracted. Like Matt said, I too am looking always for very obscure stuff. There's so many different avenues to go down with video games, especially when you start getting into accessories or ephemera or whatever. I collect a lot of displays, like original displays that they hung in stores or signs, because for me those capture sort of the emotion of going into a store and playing a video game. But funny enough, the games that mean the most to me, a lot of them I don't even have, really nice sealed copies of, So I still don't have a Final Fantasy VII, which now is blowing up because of the remake and everything. And that was one of the most important games for my childhood. So it's funny how that works out. Yeah.
That's funny because like
Final Fantasy VII in a box somewhere. Love it.
Yeah, the G.I. Joe. I did actually years ago. I put together a 9/8 run of G.I. Joe 1 through 50 just for I had to. I was just like, well, this was my run growing up. So,
Yeah.
but luckily they're, fairly cheap. So it didn't cost me a lot of money. If I was, looking for Golden Age Batmans, I'd be in trouble,
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I priced myself out of like we. What's going on? It's like I can't buy this.
Yeah.
Right.
I was always like, I'll buy it later, and then the last year I'm like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. They say like there's a saying in comics, you can't be a dealer and a collector at the same time.
Yeah.
I know, Dennis, you have an amazing collection. Obviously, you're not dealing because you're grading, but yeah, it's like that was another thing. Is that I couldn't really squirrel away much back in the dealing days because it just tied up your cash, and so yeah, so it was you kind of had to be very selective about what to sock away. So yeah, that's another interesting aspect to the market.
So let's talk about the CGC slab, and then we're gonna Dennis too. So how many slabs are there? And you want to let us know a little bit about the evolution of the slab, or maybe the current slab, and why it's the best thing ever. But also, what are the different sizes? How many are there?
Yeah, there's one basic comic slab, and we have different depths, different wells based on the size and thickness of the comics. The dimensions are usually about the same, but there's some complexities with that. The thickness is more of the variable because your Golden Age or 32 wraps plus the cover, which were reduced to 16 wraps plus the cover, and then reduced to 8 wraps by the 50s and 60s. And that's pretty much stayed consistent to now. The height and width are about the same, but then you also have like square bounds and giant size issues that are like really thick. And then you have like oversized comics, and then you've got like magazines. We have the magazine holder for magazines. And then obviously if they're little comics, there's like little digest size and all kind of little things that we can fit inside the regular size holder. But the holder is basically about the same size, and they've been consistent since we started in 2000 in terms of the height and the width, because boxes. Basically, everybody's designed all of these products around CGC, like boxes and display cases and everything. So we have to maintain that size. And as far as the holder goes, we basically have had two kinds of holders. We had the first gen, I guess you could call it, which was 2016. And there's tons of examples. We've graded about 5 million, by the way, so far. And I don't know how many of those would be the old holder. It's hard to say because a lot of them probably been cracked out and reholdered at this point. There's still tons left. But yeah, the new holder that we designed in 16, we basically made it a lot more sturdy, clear, more tamper-proof. A lot of modifications that basically improved a lot of things that over time, through feedback, we had realized that there was room for improvement on that. So, for instance, the sticker, we used to put the sticker on top of the label with the grade and the information, but those would peel off or flake off over time if they were not handled correctly. So now the label is completely on the inside of the holder. We sonically seal almost all 4 corners and the edges too, so you can't get into that thing at all. And then it's crystal clear, and then also the edges are angled, so basically you can't even bend it. It's not even bendable, really. I mean, it's like super sturdy. And what I've noticed is since we launched that new holder about 4 years ago, there's been a huge influx in not just reholders, but also a lot of people that are submitting comics because I think they want them in the holder because it frames it so beautifully that it's like it's a way to display your comic book that it adds so much visual appeal to it that it's not just a device that's used to protect the comic once you grade it and keep it from getting damaged. But also now it's taken on this new form of like a frame or something. And so yeah, I'm really proud of the holder. I think it displays beautifully. People love it, and like I said, I think a lot of people are grading it strictly just to have the holder. And they're not just trying to get a 9.8 or trying to get their book graded to sell it or check it for restoration. I'm thinking there's some people where they're just like, these are my comics, I love them, but boy, they look great in these holders, and that's why I want to send it in. So yeah, so that's where we're at with the holder now, and yeah, it's beautiful.
And Dennis, the sheer logistics of all the different cases that you guys have is mind blowing to me. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So there are other companies that will put games in acrylic, so that you can do custom sizing. But when we designed our case, we wanted a very tamper evident locking system. So all the games, this one actually is purposely broken off. But when this snaps in this banner, there are 6 locking tabs that are inserted, and you can see, I think, in here how they're actually broken. So you'll see that they crack when they're broken. Sorry, it's going to be a little hard for me to see what I'm showing here, but they'll crack, and then once they crack, that voids the certification essentially. But yeah, we have so many different SKUs. So every blister is custom fit. They go into inner wells or blisters, so that if the case breaks, the integrity of the game is still very safe. And you have a blister for every different size game, whether it's a Game Boy game or an NES game or an Atari game, and even a tiny variance in thickness. Like there are 3 different blisters just for Atari games, right? So we have maybe 50 different blister sizes right now. And as we release new systems, we're adding more. But they all fit into 4 different heights of case that have the same width and depth, but they're different sizes. So this is the standard NES one. There's a Game Boy one, which is about this tall. There's a really short one for like Super Nintendo cartridges, and then we have a taller case that's for DVD games like PS2 or any Atari games, things like that. So it's the same kind of concept in terms of games go inside of an inner well. They're put in here. They're sealed. We don't do sonic sealing, but the seams are all glued with a special kind of acrylic glue, so that you can't get into this any way other than breaking the top off. We also have other security measures, of course, such as like the holograms that we use. These are actually currency thread holograms that are provided by our partners, Canyon Drive Technologies. So that's these are like what you see kind of in the $100 bill. It's that same kind of technology. And then we also have the Matrix code, which we've been saying, Matrix app coming out soon for quite a while now. It's a very complicated app, but they're still put on every game, and they'll still be able to pull up the same information. Some of the information is actually embedded in that code. So it's like a fingerprint of the game at the time it was graded, the population at that. You can never hack that code. It's not a QR. You can be in the middle of a desert with no internet, and it'll still pull it up. But then it also ties to the internet, and you can pull up things like the pre-grading photos I talked about earlier. When we have census information, it'll be that pricing information. All of that will kind of be tied in there. So that's our case, and like Matt said, we're also very proud of what it does, and not only the security built in there, but the way that the watagames display. We wanted it to be something that anyone who, if they just have a childhood game that they grew up with, they can put it in this and put it on their mantle, right? And have it as a centerpiece for when people come over or whatever. So yeah, that's the Wata case, and we've had, they all look the same from when we launched, but we've actually had several different iterations and minor changes here and there. The label type that we use is still changing, but the bottoms and the tops, there are different processes, whether it's injection molding or whatever, that we've switched and improved for durability purposes. So, minor little things here and there, but we're always improving.
Yeah.
Okay, there might not be an answer to this, but I'll start with Matt. So, is there any type of book, size of book, or some product that is not currently being graded that CGC, is interested in maybe grading? Like, you should say treasury books, but
yeah, we've always got our eye on things that we're not currently grading. Treasury editions is one. The challenge there is the obviously the size in relation to the weight of the holder, and obviously the safety in terms of it cracking and breaking. Because the bigger it gets, the heavier it is, and the more likely it could possibly break if you drop it or mishandle it. And but we've got some ideas on that. Treasury editions is one I know people have been waiting for a while. And there's a few other areas that we're looking to move into that are semi-related to comics, or at least some, collective, areas, fields that, comic collectors get into, other things. But yeah, so we're working on, a few things right now. Some of it's kind of top secret, but
yeah.
I forgot. Dennis is doing a great job showing the holder up. I've got holders here.
Okay, yeah.
Should I take can I just show it for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
Earlier? Okay. So here we've got, this is a Spidey 59.4 classic cover. This is the new holder. So, and I'll give you an example of an old holder. This is another classic, Hulk 181, the first appearance of Wolverine. So you can see side by side the difference in the labels. First off, this one, the old one, the gray box is a little smaller. It's a little bit easier to see on the new holders here. Clarity is probably a little hard to see in this video here, but this new holder is definitely more clear. And then, what I was saying earlier is that in terms of bending it, you can't even, it doesn't, creak or anything like that. No bendability, which, adds to the safety of the book, but also just that, holding it just makes it feel a lot more sturdy. And then the label on top here, which is now inside the holder, and the information on the back. And it's got all these angles to it, which that contributes to the stiffness of the holder. So this is and then we got the let's see what we got here. We got Sig Series, which is our yellow label. It's as if the book's signed by a professional artist or famous person that has something to do with the book. It goes in there, and then finally, of course, the purple label. The rest restored. I don't have a conserve, but and so anything that has restoration with the scale we talked about earlier goes into the purple label here.
That's great. That's awesome to see all those different iterations.
Yeah.
Dennis, what about you? Is there? So I would just. I would think there's. Are there any consoles that you're not grading yet?
I laughed when you asked the question because, people don't realize this. We are so slammed and overwhelmed with demand. We have still not announced so many of the systems that are gradable. For that reason, we have the blisters and the product and the database all ready to go for a lot of the modern consoles, a lot of different things like DS and Nintendo Switch, 3DS, PlayStation 4, but we actually haven't even announced those yet because we're still working through a backlog right now. We technically haven't announced Atari, but there were some heritage sales where we did some Atari stuff and we were getting ready to announce it, and then they blew up, and now we're inundated with Atari. we still haven't even announced that. So certainly there's a lot more that we're planning on getting into. We do not do there are other companies that you can grade your console, anything from something small to something as large as an original NES console, right? And they'll put it in acrylic, but we don't, because we don't do, the limitations of our case, with the mechanisms that we built in here, the safety mechanisms, we can't do custom sizing. So there are always going to be some things that we can't grade, at least not now. We're not planning on it in the near future. We're just going to keep adding more systems. I don't think we'll be grading Sega Pico, which was an entertainment, educational system that for 5-year-olds, and the cartridges are this big, No one collects those, and there's no value to them. So I don't think we're going to be doing that anytime soon. Sorry,
that's true, because you got to gauge the demand with the cost of grading. Because there's a lot of really cool stuff that just doesn't have a big enough market because of the cost of the injection molding, building the holders, and getting the grading standards in place and all that. So it's some things like Dennis saying, it's a game this big for 5-year-olds. I don't know. It doesn't sound like something you can have a huge market for.
Well, even something like Atari cartridges, people are sending in Atari, but boxed and sealed. There are inquiries of, hey, are you going to do Atari cartridges, things like that. But again, Matt, like you said, it's better than anyone. It's the demand has to justify the price that you're going to spend on a new mold for the blister and the minimum orders. It's thousands of dollars you're looking at, and that's at a minimum hundreds and hundreds of submissions for something that maybe 50 people want, or something. So and that's going to change, and over time, if all of a sudden something blows up and people want that graded, it might make sense for us. So you have to also, there's a definite element of gauging the demand for sure.
Awesome. Well, this has been awesome. I think why don't I, Matt, is there anything else that you want our viewers to know about, or anything you want to talk about CGC before we wrap things up?
Yeah, no, I just want to say that we've got, we've been going through a lot of changes the past few years, a lot of innovations, and we have a lot more in the pipeline that we've been working on. And Deniz can certainly appreciate this. The one limitation is the time, we've just having to get everything lined up perfectly before you launch. And so, there's you guys will be seeing a lot of stuff coming up in the next few years that we're planning on, and also I'm excited about Wata being in the market, because it's just been a pleasure watching the video games blow up. I mean, Deniz and I were talking prior to Wata opening, and I wish I'd paid more attention to to what was going to happen, because it blew up really, really fast. And I grew up playing Atari. I love Atari, so I'm excited to see about you guys getting into those games. But I just think overall, seeing what's going on with Wata and the market in general, it seems like it's just a great time to be in collectibles. And the fact that we're, both companies are top notch and doing a great job certifying, I think that just adds so much more strength and trust and confidence, and more and more people that are being immersed in pop culture with the movies and the video games. I mean, they're just, heck, video games are bigger than movies now. So all this is doing is breeding more collectors and potential collectors that are just going to make their way to our industries. And I think that we're both well positioned to allow those people in to a safe environment to collect. And I think the future is very bright for both of us.
Definitely. And I mean, I'll just really quickly, recently, just kind of a sign of the times, Ultimate Fallout 4 with the PS5 announcement of the Miles Morales game, that book's gone crazy. So you have a video game that's partially driving a comic it's been pretty interesting to watch. So yeah, that's all true. Deniz, what about you? Anything else you want to let our audience know about before we wrap things up?
I think Matt summarized a lot of it. Similar to his sentiments. It's just really exciting to see the growth of this, and a lot of people who are getting into this that are, really discovering it for the first time. And for a lot of people in this very small community of video game collectors, which has tripled, quadrupled now, have been a little bit like, these guys don't know, but everyone has to start somewhere. And as a company, we're very open to new collectors coming into this, because we are run by collectors, right? Like we all of us at Wata, we actually collect video games and care about the hobby as a whole and growing it in the right way. As Matt mentioned, we also have a lot of roots in comics, so it's a very, one of our founders I didn't even mention is Mark Haspel, who was one of the guys who started CGC in '99 or 2000, right?
Yep.
And Matt, we've been discussing for a long time, the genesis of all of this. So it's a very symbiotic kind of thing. The success of both companies, and it will translate to more confident collectors, more confident buyers, and overall a healthier growth of both markets. And I think that the future is extremely bright, and it's just an exciting time. It's an exciting time. We're always, the thing that I ask of collectors is to be patient. We're still, relatively a small company. We have issues like the COVID pandemic really affected our supplies coming from China. So while demand is rising, our supplies have prohibited us from getting orders out, and it's caused some backlogs. But overall, people are extremely understanding, and that's all that we ask. And I feel it almost feels like we're all in this together with a lot of these new collectors coming in, right?
Yeah.
And with both companies. So that's it. It's just a fun time, and the future's bright. It's going to be exciting.
Well, this has been awesome. Thanks so much, both of you, for being here at AtCon 2. Also, again, for being elite sponsors of the event. I know you guys are busy. I really appreciate the time. This was a really interesting conversation, and one that I felt like was a little overdue. So thank you both.
Well, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.